Today's talk is titled Worship, to be delivered by Reverend Lynn Hopkins. The Reverend Lynn Hopkins is a Unitarian Universalist minister serving the congregation of Montgomery, Alabama. Lynn is a lifelong activist for justice and equity since the days of the Vietnam War. Raised in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., Lynn and Lynn's spouse, Carolyn, lived 20 years in the Atlanta area and briefly in Denver, Colorado, before settling in Montgomery in 2014. In all those places, Lynn was engaged with public advocacy, protest, testimony, and other activities in the areas of sexuality and gender equity, racial equity, poverty and homelessness, criminal justice, disability access, and more. Currently, Lynn serves as co-chair of the Interfaith Montgomery on the board of Montgomery Pride United, the Leadership Council of Faith and Action Alabama, and is a member of Trust, Transgender Religious Professional Unitarian Universalist Together. Lynn identifies as queer and gender non-binary and prefers the use of Lynn's first name in place of pronouns. I give you Reverend Lynn.
Thank you, Janet. And thank you, Randy, for the invitation and your mastery of the technology. And thank you, Mary, for the rendition as well as the selection of that piece. I love words. Words give voice to my rage, my jubilation, my wonder. Even in silence, words are my first tool for solving problems, exploring ideas, and resolving contradictions or conflicts. They can be my greatest adversary as I struggle to articulate meaning, but on difficult days, words are my best company. Used recklessly, words can confuse, deceive, and cause wounds that may never fully heal. They are not to be taken lightly. But when we are at our best, our words can evoke, impart, inspire, and transport. Many of the words in common usage are used so carelessly that they become almost empty of intended meaning. Words that should have the greatest power, words like awe, love, faith, require a host of other words to clarify what we mean when we use them. Other words have become so laden with the baggage of dominant culture that they lose much of their value, distorted and corrupted by usage in ways that oppress rather than liberate. We still need them, or at least we need something to point to the things they once described, but we become reluctant to speak, lest we be misunderstood and do harm to the people and the values that we cherish. Of course, there are words that are not appropriate for speaking aloud, words of violence and hatred, like racial and ethnic slurs. There are others, words that I use frequently that I nonetheless would not speak from a pulpit unless I was quoting someone. There are a handful of words that I use lovingly with great care that tend to make Unitarian Universalists uncomfortable. Now, it is my strongly held view that the ability to create that discomfort is the most important, the most venerable power that words can possess. While discomfort is not always creative, it is always the first thing that happens in the process of growth, of maturation, of liberation, and of transformation. Now, if you're in my generation, you remember George Carlin. The comedic genius in 1972 mocked our culture of propriety in a monologue about 7 words you can't say on television. His point was made when he was arrested for obscenity immediately after the show. Today, you can hear all of them on late night basic cable. But in his honor, in honor of George Carlin's most famous treatise, I suggest that there are 7 words you can't say in UU. God, sin, repentance, salvation, holiness, prayer, and worship. Today, I want to consider that last one, a word that has been the subject of controversy in ministers' groups on social media as recently as this week. We disagree. Worship. It's a classic story of a word that has been co-opted and corrupted beyond recognition. Its roots lie in a word that we use often and easily, worth, as in the first principle, inherent worth and dignity. Worship began just as a verbal contraction of worthship, which, let's face it, is hard to pronounce. Worthship, assessing or imparting some value of significant or appreciable worth. If you enjoy the TV programs of the British Commonwealth known as procedurals, typically depictions of legal drama, you'll be acquainted with the practice of using quasi-religious words as forms of respectful address. Your Grace, my Lord, your worship. What I didn't know until I began diving into the origins and usage of the word is that worship is actually the lowest level of professional honor. Administratively, it's given to local officials like city councilmen. It indicates not that I revere excellence or eminence or highness in you, but simply that I recognize you have worth, your worthship. I have no idea how that eventually came to refer to how people praise or honor a supreme being, but there it is, worthship. I think it's especially relevant this year as we, the Unitarian Universalist Association worldwide, consider a new expression of our religious commitment in terms of values. At General Assembly this year, there will be a vote following more discussion on incorporating a statement of our shared values in the place where our statement of principles now exists. If it is ratified, Article 2 of the UUA bylaws will contain a collection of values that we, as Unitarian Universalists, regard as having greatest worth, worthship. It's a momentous decision for the association, an enormous undertaking to reach any semblance of agreement among such a diverse and complicated bunch of folks. The formal process has taken 3 years so far. And there are ways in which this evolution has actually been going on for more than a decade. This great collective act of worthship within our association. But the truth is, we as individuals are taking actions of worthship all the time. It's really just a matter of assigning value to something. It's making a choice. When we purchase one thing rather than another, or from one vendor rather than another. When we show up at a gathering rather than sleeping in, it's a statement of what has greater worth to us. Giving honor through our choices to our values. Everything we do is by choice, even if most of it is largely unconscious and rote. And every choice represents something that we value above other things. Every contribution of money, time, effort, and attention is an act of worship. Most choices we make may be trivial, what to eat, what to wear, but some of our unconscious choices are anything but trivial. Whether we give attention to people that we encounter, how and if we speak to one another with intimate partners or coworkers or strangers or people who look and sound differently from us. Do we honor our value of love, compassion, and justice? When we do, it is an act of worship, no matter how small, to say hello with a smile, to ask how someone is feeling, and listen mindfully. These things are worship. Of course, our choices are unconsciously shaped by things beyond our control. In many cases, anxieties, personality disorders, neurodiversity, childhood trauma can cause us to neglect things that we would choose to give attention to forget or overlook or procrastinate. So it's essential to give ourselves and one another grace and empathy, to forgive ourselves and forgive each other, is also an act of worship. In our free and responsible truth, search for truth and meaning, that fourth principle, the choices that we make day to day, minute to minute, the tiny acts of worship are how we make meaning through all the noise. It is easy, and perhaps most of us do, to go through daily life without paying much attention. There are places we need to be, things we need to do. But if we will practice attention, mindfulness, consideration to the small and large choices we are making, it becomes possible to recognize those holy things all around us and to acknowledge that in each choice we are offering worship to things that we value. The quote from Barbara Brown Taylor talks about engaging the most ordinary physical activities with the most exquisite attention. What is saving my life now, she says, is becoming more fully human, trusting there is no way to God apart from real life in the real world. I don't use or think about the word God very often, but I know what she means there. That the way in which we transcend, the way in which we experience wholeness, the way in which we become able to recognize the awesome power in the world in which we live and in one another. The only way to do that is to engage the most ordinary physical activities with the most exquisite attention. It is usually the case that no harm is done if we don't pay attention, except that so much is lost. And so, as we make these choices, these daily choices, these where do I go now and where shall I sit and whom shall I address and what shall be my tone of voice and how long shall I stay? All of these things. May we acknowledge that these things are a recognition of the worth that we assign to one another and to our values, so that we may experience more fully life in the real world. May it be so.